The OBR is not in government. It's a Quango. It's out there to evaluate and does this ridiculous process of sending stuff to the OBR, and then 15 days later or something, it sent it all back and says, no, it doesn't add up. I mean, have you ever heard of anything so absurd? You know, I mean, no government in the world operates like that that's of any substance.
One of the events of today is that Liz Truss has warned against the government's plans to give more powers to the Office for Budget Responsibility, due to be debated later. That's part of the Budget Responsibility Bill in Parliament. Well, let's bring in Liz Truss's economic guru, Patrick Minford, Professor of Applied Economics at Cardiff University. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Now, famously, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng sidelined the OBR when they produced their economic statement. Was that a mistake with hindsight?
Well, of course, at the time, the OBR was in pole position, so it was seen as a mistake because it was seen as damaging their credibility, because the OBR had been put in that pole position by the Treasury. But that was precisely the problem, really. I mean, we have elections and we have governments which have at the center of their agendas tax and spending, and then the Treasury simply opts out of evaluating it and getting it right. It has no modeling capacity. It doesn't have any accounting capacity. It passes it all over to the OBR, which is a Quango. And so the Treasury just washes its hands of its responsibilities. And that's the problem, really. And that was the problem with Liz Truss. The Treasury wasn't willing or able to do the necessary accounting and evaluation work that would have supported her program. And so when the OBR was cut out of the loop, you know, there was nothing in its place.
But I mean, the Treasury weren't asked to do it either, were they? Which, you know, the question is whether you do need some sort of evaluation of economic policy, or whether, because people have got a mandate in an election of some kind, they just come in and, you know, dictate how it should go.
No, I agree with you. It has to be an evaluation. I mean, what the Treasury, that's the Treasury's job. You know, it's extraordinary. The Treasury has passed its monetary policy job that it once had to the Bank of England and delegated all that. And now it's passed all its tax and spending job to the OBR. And so the Treasury has lots of power to say no to things and to throw its weight around, but no responsibility for the complete catastrophe that economic policy has become under both governments.
But whether or not it's done in the Treasury or done by the OBR, couldn't evaluation actually mean that we end up with better economic policy?
Well, yes, of course, absolutely. Adam, we have to have good policy. That's the job of government, to deliver good policy. I mean, it's at the center of its role. I mean, the government.
The OBR is a government agency as well, isn't it?
It's a Quango, of course. It's got these delegated powers to evaluate policy. But if you look at its capacity, it's very limited. It has very limited modeling capacity, and it does accounting, of course. It adds up. It's got computers that, you know, operate models in the sense that they're sort of adding up machines that make everything, you know, add up to GDP and so on. But in terms of capacity to evaluate, it's got very little. And that's really crucial, because a modern government has to decide on optimal tax and spending policy to support its objectives, which in this case, in the Labour government, and of course it should have been the last government, were growth.
I mean, that could be an argument for beefing up the OBR, as Labour's proposing in its bill, couldn't it?
Well, you know, it depends what you mean by beefing up. I mean, the government
you said it had
is
limited
responsible.
capacity, yeah.
Well, the government is responsible for its policies and should design good policies. And the OBR is not in government. It's a Quango. It's out there to evaluate and does this ridiculous process of sending stuff to the OBR, and then 15 days later or something, it sent it all back and says, no, it doesn't add up. I mean, have you ever heard of anything so absurd? You know, I mean, no government in the world operates like that that's of any substance. There are, of course, lots of checks and balances. I mean, the OBR was originally set up as a sort of check and balance outside government to make sure government was kosher and doing all the right things and not betraying trust. But if you think about that task, that's done by lots of think tanks and the markets, brokerage houses, banks. They all comment on the. There's lots of people outside the Treasury who are there to comment on things and to say it doesn't add up. But that's the job of the OBR. But it should actually be inside government. I mean, there should be Treasury capacity to evaluate and give us good taxes that support growth and spending policies that support growth, instead of which they say things and then pass them back to the OBR. And it's really nonsense to say, well, therefore we should have a Quango that does the job of the Treasury. I mean, the Treasury is supposed to be the central powerhouse of economic thinking, and yet it's opted out. It's passed the buck to some other agency, and then it has power to do all sorts of things, but no responsibility. It's crazy. It's a crazy system. I mean, no other developed country in the world has a system like that.
Well, there's the Office of Management of the Budget, isn't there, in the US?
But that's a parliamentary, congressional power, which is quite different. Under the US, the separation of powers. So Congress has its own powers. Of course, Parliament also has its bodies that can evaluate things, which is perfectly healthy for its committees. And that's perfectly okay. And it has those powers. And we don't really need another Quango to kind of to have its power from the Treasury shuffled to it. It's just an abandonment of responsibility, it seems to me, by government.
Whether you like it or not, what do you think of the OBR's performance? Is it doing a good job?
Well, I haven't really got much of a beef against the OBR. I mean, obviously it has lots of faults. It doesn't do forecasting frightfully well. But
I mean, Liz Truss says it's inaccurate and its projections have been incorrect.
Well, of course, but then, that is true. That's absolutely true. Its forecasting record isn't very good. But then, of course, forecasting records of most bodies isn't very good. It's pretty hard. Forecasting is a pretty hard business, as you know, Adam. I mean, it's very hard to get right. And if you do, it's usually by luck rather than by good judgment. So I wouldn't be that critical of the OBR in terms of its forecasting, though it hasn't done frightfully well. I think the main problem with the OBR is it's not inside the government, formulating good policy on the basis of good models and good accounting procedures. I mean, its accounting is okay, but its modeling capacity is inadequate. And that's what government should have. It should have better modeling capacity. I mean, I was once in the Treasury, and in those days, it got a lot of things wrong, but it wasn't short of good people trying to do good analytical work. Nowadays, there's nobody in the Treasury that one knows of who's doing any good analytical work and trying to evaluate taxes. I mean, to evaluate taxes, it's not a forecasting job. It's an analytical modeling job, and they don't have the capacity to do it anymore, which is tragic, really. It's all been got rid of, and the Treasury is really a hollowed out agency with power, but absent responsibility, which is completely unhealthy. And that's really what Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer ought to be tackling. They should be getting us a better government machine that can actually capable of doing the analysis that the OBR really isn't capable of doing.
And looking at back to the so-called mini budget under Liz Truss, how bad was it in your view? How much of a disaster?
Well, the problem was that politically there was no really backing for the strategy. There was no kind of document that set it all out and calmed everybody down about the long term. For solvency, you need a long-term plan, and that wasn't really enunciated at the time. And more to the point, of course, there was all this crisis in the gilt-edge markets because of the LDI problems and the Bank of England's, failures to raise interest rates rapidly. And in the end, it was the Bank of England that destroyed the government by not keeping the gilt-edge markets calm, allowing the gilt-edge markets to panic about future inflation and future interest rates. So really, in the end, it was the Bank of England that brought the government down, not the Treasuries, because of course, you see, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng had said there was going to be a longer term document in a month or so. But of course, it was all too far in the future. And meanwhile, the Bank of England brought the whole shooting match down.
Professor Patrick Minford, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And just a reminder that if you want to watch the best videos from Times Radio, you can subscribe to our social media channels. There are well over 800,000 subscribers to us on YouTube, giving you in-depth political analysis, the newest takes on the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, and interviews with well-known personalities. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Just search for Times Radio on your chosen medium. And if you go to Times Radio, you can click on the subscribe button to follow and get the latest videos as soon as they're published.